Good evening, church family and friends, and thank you for joining me for another session of the book of Judges. I know it has been a long time since we've been together, probably about 4 or 5 weeks if my calculations are right, and it is for that reason I'd like for us to do a big review tonight of the first 5 chapters of the book of Judges, and then this will get us ready for chapter 6 next week. In Judges chapter 1, and starting in verse 3, we see where the 2 tribes of Judah and Simeon, they form an alliance. Now, Judah is the bigger of the 2, and that's why they wanted to help Simeon, who was not as many, and they wanted to help them conquer their lands and vice versa, just as God had commanded. And so we see where Judah had great victories. And we see this all through chapter 1 until, of course, we come to verse 19. And in verse 19, they encountered a formidable foe. The scriptures teach that the reason why they were so formidable was because they had iron chariots. And we discussed together what that meant. Unfortunately, in verse 19, that they had such good campaigns and they were victorious in their campaigns. But when you go to verse 19, we see where they allowed themselves to become intimidated by a superior force. Now, according to the famous archaeologist Yigal Yadin, we talked about the 3 primary factors in battle, especially in the ancient times. And what decided most battles was mobility, firepower, and security. And these iron chariots that were possessed by these people of the valley, they had these advantages. And this played into the intimidation that the people of Judah felt. But the problem was not that the inhabitants of the valley had a more superior army. It was the fact that Judah had allowed themselves to become intimidated. And because of that intimidation, they had a weakness of faith. When we apply this to our own life, it reminds me of what the Apostle Paul told Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 7. He says, "For God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and love and of a sound mind." Go to verse 2 of chapter 1. In verse 2 of chapter 1, why all of a sudden did the people of Judah allow this formidable force to intimidate them? It wasn't because of the force itself, it was because of their weakness of faith. Notice in verse 2, Judah were given assurance of victory. But for some reason, when they came up against this tougher foe, all of a sudden those assurances just melted and they became fearful. And so Judah just kind of stops the military juggernaut right there, and they just kind of sit there and not do anything. They go to the lands that they have conquered. They settle those, but they don't go any further. So they don't do exactly what God has told them to do about driving the foe out of their land allotment. And then we go to the rest of chapter 1. And unfortunately, we go from bad to worse, don't we? Because we see the other tribes. It mentions Benjamin, and it mentions the house of Joseph, which would have included Ephraim and Manasseh, and the other tribes. And they don't do what they were commanded to do. In fact, the scriptures show us that they don't even attempt it. Why? Because they're tired of war. They're tired of all this fighting, and so the other tribes did not even try, and they disobeyed God. God gave them a directive, and because that directive was not obeyed, the angel of the Lord came to a place called Bochim. Notice in verse 3 of chapter 2 of Judges, the punishment, the pronouncement of punishment, rather, that was said. Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall be thorns in your side, and their gods shall be a snare to you. There are two parts of that pronouncement that I'd like for you to keep in mind. The first one is how the Lord said that they would be thorns in their side. And the second pronouncement is that the gods, these foreign gods, would be a snare to them. Now, as we continue, notice Galatians chapter 6 in verse 7. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7. You know, the Apostle Paul in the book of Romans, with inspired hand, says that those things which were written for our time were written for our learning, that through the patience and the comfort of the Scriptures we might have hope. And so this is the application that we come to this juncture in Judges chapter 2, Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7. Notice, it says, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." And that's exactly what we see with the inhabitants and their interaction with God and the angel at Bochim. In fact, they lifted a lamentation, as you can see there in chapter 2 of Judges. They lifted up a lamentation before God. They offered sacrifices to God, but they had already planted their seed, and now they were sowing what they had planted. And so that is why they called the location of this particular place Bochim. Bochim means that of weepers, or a place of weeping. Well, this brings in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 31, doesn't it? When the inspired man that wrote Hebrews says, "For it is a terrible thing to fall into the hands of an angry God." And that's exactly what we see here. We see a God who is angry with his people. Why? Because they willfully disobeyed what he told them to do. Well, brother and sister and friend, that lesson is the same today as it was to those people in their day. God expects you and I to be obedient to his will and to continue thereby in that obedience. Because when judgment comes upon you and I, there's going to be great weeping and lamentation of the disobedient. But it's going to be too late, because they disobeyed the master. The master's not going to allow them to come in, and they're going to be thrown to the place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. What a sobering lesson for you and I to learn from the example of God's people in Judges chapter 2. Yes, they were sorry, but their sorry did not help them at all. And because of this, God would hand them over into the hands of foreign powers because of continued disobedience. And this leads us to one of the main observations that we made in the first two lessons, and that was the tumultuous cyclical pattern that we see in the Judges. And if you remember, we described that as that of a clock. So at 12 o'clock, you have the people of God being at peace and prosperity. And then you go to 3 o'clock, and at 3 o'clock, they have become disobedient to the will of God. They're no longer listening, and they're doing things that are mocking God and going against his will. So now go to 6 o'clock, and now they are put in bondage for a number of years by a foreign power. Now, within that bondage, they cry for a judge. Go up to 9 o'clock. God gives them a judge. They conquer the foe of the foe of those who had taken them in bondage at the 6 o'clock position. You get to 9 o'clock, we have the judge delivers them. And then you go back that during that judge's tenure, you go back to 12 where there is peace and prosperity. But one thing that we're going to continue to witness together as we continue this study of the book of Judges is once again how cyclical this pattern is of these people of Israel. Now, it is so easy to look at them, point our finger at them, put the hammer of judgment on them, and say, boy, you people just don't learn, do you? What were you thinking? God gave you opportunity, He gave you judges, and then you just continue doing what you were doing. Shame on you. Well, we can't say that because in our own life, we do the same thing. Whether we want to admit to it or not, we're guilty of the same thing. And when you look at humanity's history and the many civilizations that encompass that history, you notice the very same cyclical pattern that we see with the judges in the long ago. The difference is civilizations of history were not of God. The people of Israel were supposed to be of God, and that makes their problem even worse in the eyes of the scriptural truth. They knew what to do, and they chose not to. Notice in Judges chapter 3, this is illustrated for us when you go through verses 2 through 4. We learned in these verses that the teaching of war was not to build confidence from a military perspective, but the teaching of war were exercises for them to learn faith in God. So notice with me here that God is going to give them the opportunity to come closer to Him by building faith in Him. But how do they respond to God's benevolent mercy here? Go to verses 6 and 7. And let us ask the tough question. Did they fail the test? Did they grow closer in faith to God? Notice with me verse 6 and 7. It says, so the people, chapter 3, and they took their daughters to be their wives and gave their daughters to their sons, and they served other gods. Of course, go to verse 5. Thus the children of Israel dwelt among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. They took their daughters to be their wives and gave their daughters to their sons. They served their gods. Verse 7. So the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and Asherahs. They mocked God. God gave them the opportunity to build faith in Him. And what did they do with that opportunity? They didn't want it. They wanted pleasure. They wanted the easy life, if you will. And so instead of warring against these nations that God has rendered judgment upon, they decided, well, we don't want to do that. And so God gives them over into the hands of a foreign power. But verses 6 and 7 is a very important lesson for you and I today in the light of 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 14. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 14, the inspired apostle Paul is reminding the church at Corinth this very important element that we see happening in Judges chapter 3. Notice what he says with me. Be not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion has light with darkness? Now, to answer Paul's question, I want us to go to the writing of the inspired apostle John in 1 John chapter 1, verses 5 and 6. In 1 John chapter 1, verses 5 and 6, notice how the apostle Paul's question is answered in this way. This then is the message which we have heard of Him and declare unto you, that God is light, and in Him is no darkness at all. If we say that we have fellowship with him and walk in darkness, we lie and do not the truth. So notice the lesson here that we are learning from Judges chapter 3. They decided to cohabitate with darkness. They decided to no longer be children of light. And as we learned in verse 7, these unholy unions brought upon great unholiness in the minds and actions of the people, didn't they? And that reminds me of another lesson given to us by the inspired Apostle Paul as we look at together the application of what we are learning. Turn with me to 1 Corinthians 15 in verse 33. And this is the scriptural commentary of exactly what you and I are witnessing here in Judges 3. The Apostle Paul says, "Be not deceived, evil companions corrupt good morals." Is that not what we see here in Judges chapter 3? It's exactly what we see here in Judges chapter 3. He who sows the wind shall reap the whirlwind. We see this in the inspired writings of the prophet Hosea in chapter 8 and verse 7. And this is exactly what we see the people of God doing in Judges chapter 3. And so because of this, God subjects his people to bondage at the hands of a man of Cushan Rishathaim of Mesopotamia for 8 years. So for 8 years they are put into bondage by a foreign power. But once again, this is not God being mean, but this is God working within his righteousness. He didn't want this for his people, but it's what they received from him because they became depraved in their thinking, and God carried them over within that depravity. So the people of God pray for a deliverer. And we see the mercy of God in this next, don't we? We see where God gave them Othniel. And we discussed how Othniel, starting in verse 12, as Othniel raises up an army. I'll get it out here in a minute. Othniel raises an army, and they kick out Cushan Rishathaim out of the land, and there is peace. But notice with me in verse 12, the peace doesn't last but for 40 years, and they're right back to doing what they were doing that put them in the hands of Cushan Rishathaim to begin with. They did evil that was in the sight of the Lord. And so what does God do? God says, all right, have it your way. And he puts them in bondage. This time in the hands of Eglon, king of Moab. And this is for 18 years. So we see where Eglon, king of Moab, and you can see by his physical physique, as the scriptures show us, he is gluttonous. He is abusing the people. And so God raises another judge, and his name is Ehud. And Ehud or Ehud assassinates Eglon. The scriptures say that Ehud slams a dagger into Eglon's stomach, and Eglon's stomach was so big and round that the dagger kind of sinks in and the fat just rolls right over it. And Eglon is killed. We see where then Ehud raises an army and defeats Moab. And he rules over the people for 80 years. But this peace was not to last. Because once again we see that cyclical pattern continue its tumultuous cycle. And what do we have? We have disobedience once again. So God once again says, all right. And he puts them into the hands of Jabin, king of Hazor, who is a Canaanite. Now, within Jabin, king of Hazor's taking over of the people of Israel, we see a very rough place to live. And I'm going into my notes here because I don't want to miss any of this. We get the sense of this in Judges chapter 5. So if you remember, we combined Judges chapter 4 and Judges chapter 5 really explain well for us what's happening in Judges chapter 4. Deborah says with inspired hand, highways were deserted. Travelers walked along the byways. Village life ceased in Israel. So under Jabin, king of Hazor, there is great fear for safety. Well, because there's no activity going on, it's not surprising that the Philistines from the south start to think, hey, there's nothing really going on, so we're going to attack from another side of this land. But they came across a very formidable foe by the name of Shamgar. And Shamgar, if you remember, takes an ox goad. And an ox goad was a pointy stick that they would poke the ox with to keep them moving as the ox were plowing the fields. And so Shamgar takes one of these pointy sticks, and many a Philistine meets their death. But we need to keep that in mind, Philistine, because that's going to come again when we talk about Samson. So these people are in bondage. The conditions that they are living in is very deplorable. But again, why did all of this happen? It happened because these people chose to not follow God. Israel did again what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and because of that, God gave them over into their depravity. So we see where, as we come to the end of our review, he raises two judges, one by the name of Deborah, the other one by the name of Barak. And they brought defeat to Jabin, king of Hazor's mercenary known as Sisera, who had a large chariotry. And we saw together where that chariotry was brought to nothing by Barak and his forces. But what was very interesting is when Deborah told Barak to arise and raise an army and attack Jabin, king of Hazor, we see where Barak has a weakness of faith as well. And he says, but only if you go with me. Well, because of that weakness of faith, Deborah informs him that it would not be him that would defeat this mercenary by the name of Sisera, but it would be by the hand of a woman. And as we learned together, that woman's name was Jael. And Jael's husband had assisted Sisera. And so when Sisera came to him after being defeated in battle, he thought it was a place of safety. And so, but Jael proved it wasn't a place of safety, because she took a tent peg and nailed him to the ground through the temple as he was sleeping. And so, Deborah and Barak, there is peace in the land for a number of years, but once again the people go back right to what they were doing. And that brings us to chapter 6, and that is where we will pick up for next time. We will review the things that we have learned in chapter 6, and then we will continue talking about Gideon. So I know that was a lot of information. I really appreciate your patience and sticking with us as we went through that review. But also let us keep in mind those applications, very important applications that we learned from the New Testament, and always be willing to ask ourselves as we continue in this life, am I following God? Am I doing His will? Or am I mocking His will? Thank you so much for joining us, and until we meet again, I bid you all a very pleasant good evening.